Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for stopping by again. Look, we're just going to jump right into this one and talk about this recent article, which says that environmental groups are being warned against talking about climate change as a fact because that fact could be seen as partisan in the upcoming 2019 federal election. Now that sounds absurd, but if you read the article, that headline's actually quite accurate. The argument from Elections Canada, at least right now, I'm really hoping they're going to smarten up and address this absurdity. But they're arguing right now that because Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada basically don't believe that climate change is real, or more accurately, they say that if any climate change is happening, it's being driven by other forces, or talking about excessive carbon dioxide emissions as bad or pollution or what have you, is also partisan because Maxime Bernier and the People's Party reject that. So in a sense, there's 6 parties in Canada that have a shot at winning seats in this election, realistically. You know, the Greens, the NDP, the Liberals, the Conservatives, the Bloc, and the PPC. And 5 of those 6 parties recognize climate change as human-caused. Now, to varying degrees, they have a desire to fix it. Some have a great focus on it. Some, like the Conservatives, don't have very much at all of a focus on climate change, but they don't deny it. So this is essentially a viewpoint held by parties representing upwards of 97-98% of voters. And it's being deemed partisan because one party with one MP right now who is not elected as an MP of that party is suggesting that climate change is not real from a human-made perspective. Again, to be clear here, this is not saying that an environmental group who says climate change is real, we need to address it, vote for the Liberal Party to address it. That's clearly partisan. Or even saying climate change is real, we have to address it, do not vote for the PPC or Conservatives. That's also partisan. And there are strict rules set about how third-party groups, aka not political parties themselves, can engage in political partisan messaging and advertising during an election. There's rules about how much they can spend, about how they have to disclose it, how they have to register. I'm not going to go into all of that. It's super boring, but it's very important. But the reality is that talking about issues disconnected from partisanship shouldn't be seen as partisan activity. If an environmentalist group wants to raise the awareness of how carbon dioxide emissions are causing environmental and social and economic issues, that should not be seen in isolation as partisan. And to call it as such is essentially silencing discourse during an election period. These groups won't be able to, for instance, spend, money on a Facebook ad without having to register, even if they're only trying to raise, in a non-partisan sense, awareness about climate change. Letting people know, for instance, that, emissions are bad, or letting people know that human-made climate change is putting at risk our coastlines, or letting people know that human-made climate change is causing some of the forest fires we've been seeing, or is intensifying the forest fires we've been seeing, or is lengthening the forest fire season, quote-unquote, that we've been seeing. Doing that during the election, right now, according to Elections Canada, that may well be seen as partisan. And so lest you think that I'm being alarmist here, or that I'm reading beyond the scope of the article, here's a portion here sort of in the middle of the piece. It says that because of all this, Elections Canada is warning that any third party that promotes information about carbon dioxide as a pollutant or climate change as an emergency could be considered indirectly advocating against Bernier and his party. Activities can be considered partisan by Elections Canada even if they don't mention a candidate or party by name, the agency's rules say. An Elections Canada spokesman confirmed, quote, such a recommendation would be something we would give, end quote. That is bonkers. I understand the point. I understand that you don't always have to mention a party's name. So for instance, you could mention a specific action that's clearly done by Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. And we all know it is, and they know it is, and the listener knows it is, but it's still clearly partisan. But this simply talking in a very broad concept about the dangers of climate change is not a partisan activity. It isn't. Not at all. And if people think it is, well then so much else could be partisan. This is an extremely slippery slope. Is talking about labor conditions by default partisan. Like, we could go on and on and on and on about this, but the reality is that this is not partisan. This is an absurd recommendation by Elections Canada, and in reality, they're shoehorning this into a partisan position, because effectively what they're saying is that if one political party, no matter how insignificant and small and out of touch with the others, tends to suggest that one issue is theirs, then no other third-party group will be able to take a position in opposition to that. So again, like, for example, like, what if a political party took an opposition to gay marriage? Is promoting gay marriage as a good thing partisan? Is advertising a gay marriage-friendly church partisan? Like, where does this end? Like, honestly, where does this end? And the answer is I don't know, because I don't think this was well thought out. I don't think this is well thought out at all. And here's what's key here, because there's confusion. There's confusion like, okay, well, you're allowed to say what you want, but if you spend money, you're not allowed to do it, and it's super confusing. But the key factor, and the piece ends on this, it says the situation is, quote, contributing to ongoing confusion, end quote, about what environment charities can and cannot do, and will give fuel to pro-oil groups that want to silence their opponents, Abreu added. So in a sense, it's not even necessarily about a formal ban. It's what you might call a certain form of speech chill. That it's not so much about saying you cannot do this. It's about saying we would recommend you not do it. Whether or not you would get in trouble or not, whether or not we would fine you, whether or not that speech would actually be considered partisan, and you'd have to register, and on and on and on. It's going to make many environmental groups, some of which are maybe without a whole lot of resources, maybe don't have the resources to formally register and do things like this, it's going to make them question even talking about basic facts and reason. Them going out in public and handing out leaflets saying climate change is real. What if they printed $600 worth of paper? Is that considered partisan spending? Because, say, in outside Union Station in Toronto, they handed out $600 worth of flyers, and those flyers said that climate change is real. Let's all work together, Canada, to stop climate change. Is that partisan now because one party denies that? Honestly, I have no friggin' idea. And I don't know if any of you guys do, and I don't know if the environmentalist groups do. And Elections Canada being like, well, we don't know for sure, but we would recommend against it, means they don't really know either. But the default position seems to be against free speech in terms of what third-party groups can say about general issues. And to hammer this home, here's a quote from the article further up. It says, at this point, unless I can get greater clarification after the writ is dropped, we should stop doing anything online that talks about climate change, which is our entire mandate. You feel like you're being drawn into this space where you're being characterized as being a partisan entity for putting up Facebook ads that say climate change is real, which seems ridiculous to me. And they go on to note that this is all kind of part of that Stephen Harper era context where groups that had ideological and moral and political positions, but not partisan positions, were often targeted, and their status as a charitable entity was under risk, and this created major issues for them politically and financially and infrastructurally and administratively, so that even if the actions they were going to take or did take wouldn't actually count as partisan, the fear alone forced them to change how they operated. And some suggested that that was the goal all along by Stephen Harper and his government, to effectively silence certain groups that had different views from them. And so here, some people feel that whether or not Elections Canada will ever formally investigate groups that say climate change is real as partisan, simply saying that it might happen will fundamentally change how some third-party groups talk about issues, even not directly related to partisan politics. I don't think this is a good direction. I'm in general support of the idea that third-party spending should be transparent to Canadians. That because political parties can't take donations anymore from unions and corporations or what have you, that third-party spending is now a key venue for those groups to influence elections, to influence voters and policies and what have you. So Canadians need to know who are putting forth these videos, when they're supporting a particular candidate, when they're opposing a particular candidate or party. Canadians deserve to know that. And that even modest spending, again, even say $1,000, I don't mind the fact that people are forced to disclose that. So what's the solution here? Elections Canada needs to smarten up. They need to go back to the drawing board. And if this is actually a fair interpretation of the policy, that policy needs to be tweaked. And if this isn't a fair interpretation and this was just a spokesperson who maybe got it wrong, they need to clarify, and they need to do it quick, and they need to do it emphatically. Because these groups who operate before and during and after elections need to know what they can and cannot say lest they be considered partisan. Because this is really going to constrain them in their ability to talk to and talk with Canadians. At the end of the day, Canadians deserve to know that their political system has integrity and security, not just in how the votes are counted, but in terms of understanding who is influencing the process and how they're influencing the process. But that security and integrity should not be used as an excuse to weaken the speech and to weaken the rights of expression of groups that happen to talk about issues that are political but that aren't partisan necessarily.